Why can't people see that they are being horribly exploited by greedy capitalists who rob them of the surplus value of their labor in order to perpetuate income inequality and maintain their economic hierarchy? Yeah. What does all of that mean? And perhaps more importantly, is it true? Well, one of the many critiques that Karl Marx made about capitalism was the idea that capitalists, in this case, think business owners or entrepreneurs, exploit their employees because they pay them less than the actual value of their labor. Marx argued that this is what profit essentially was, and his overall argument goes a little bit like this. A worker shows up to his or her job and puts in a full day's work in exchange for a wage. Now, in Marx's perfect society, that wage would be a direct reflection of the total value of the work that was put in, providing whatever the product or service was. But this begs a question. How do we determine what the total value of somebody's work was providing that product or service? Well, according to Marx, it was based on the total cost of all of the labor that went into producing whatever the product or service was. For instance, what is the value of a cup of coffee? Well, it would include all of the labor that went into everything that made the cup of coffee possible, which would include not only the labor of the employee who prepared the coffee, but the entire labor supply chain. And this is what's commonly known as the labor theory of value. But see, the greedy business owner thwarts this process because he does not give the laborer the full amount of the value of their labor. He keeps some of it back in the form of profit. And Marx equated that with exploitation. Any amount of money that was produced by the employee that did not go to the employee is exploitive. And that seems pretty direct and simple enough, but there's a couple problems. One, the labor theory of value itself seems to make sense until you really start to think about it. Labor certainly factors into the price of a product, but that doesn't necessarily determine the value, because value is much more subjective. Digging a ditch with a spork may require a ton of labor. That doesn't mean that anybody would value that ditch. Value is ultimately determined by how much other people want the product or service you have and are willing to voluntarily pay for it. And here's the thing, how much a person may value a particular product or service can vary widely based off of a number of other factors. The next problem is this idea of profit equaling exploitation. Profit is simply the amount of money left over after all of the costs of production are considered. Well, according to Marx, the laborer is getting ripped off or exploited because that money should go to the laborer. But again, this begs another very important question. If that's true, and all these laborers are just getting horribly exploited, then why doesn't the laborer simply do the work themselves and capture all of that excess money they're losing by working for someone else? Put more simply, why doesn't the laborer leave the coffee shop, go back to their house where they have their own coffee machine, start to make coffee, then walk out on their front porch and attempt to sell it? Well, we know the answer. It's because they probably wouldn't make any money. This is because the same labor applied in one scenario produces a very, very different outcome than the same labor produced in a different scenario. The labor by itself is nowhere near as valuable as it is using the capital investment that the entrepreneur or business owner has provided. The entrepreneur has invested time, money, effort in order to buy or construct a shop, handle payroll, get products delivered, advertise, pay property taxes, comply with regulations, try to anticipate what customer demand is going to look like day by day, etc., etc., etc. All of which makes the employee's individual labor far more productive than it would be without all of those things. And Marx effectively fails to properly take into consideration all of that investment and the risk the entrepreneur is taking in his overall analysis of the situation. Now, is it true that you can have a bad boss that exploits laborers? Absolutely. Is it also true that you can have bad laborers that exploit their boss by perhaps not putting in a full day work or stealing for the company or doing any number of things? Sure, people aren't perfect, and therefore systems made by people aren't perfect. But at the end of the day, perhaps the best argument for one system or another is not simply a logical breakdown of the facts or incentive structures, but to once again ask a very simple question. How do people respond in these different environments? If Marx really was the advocate for labor that he claimed to be, well, then we should see any sort of government which institutes Marxist policies creating a great environment for laborers. And yet, we have ample examples of laborers fleeing Marxist countries, desperately trying to get to capitalist ones. On the other hand, we have almost no examples of laborers fleeing capitalist countries to get to Marxist ones. So I guess we have our answer.